This is the second video I've done on Heart of Darkness. It's actually going to be for part one of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. In the last video, the intro, we talked about Joseph Conrad's biography and how Joseph Conrad wrote from his life. And we also talked about colonialism and how that was devastating to the Africans and their country. And finally, at the last slide, we talked about what Joseph Conrad's intent and purpose was for Heart of Darkness. He wants to give you the experience that he had as a pilot on the Congo. He wants you to see his theme of somberness, darkness, sadness. He wants you to feel what he felt experiencing that, seeing so much devastation to the Africans. And he wants you at the end of the book not only to have these feelings, but to have these feelings resonate in you as you put the book down and go on with your life. He wants it to mean something to you so that you don't repeat the past. So we saw all that in the first video, the introduction. Now I want to get into the actual book and literary features of Heart of Darkness. First thing I want to say is that this is one of the first impressionistic pieces of literature. You might be familiar with Impressionism as an art form. Impressionism, as it says here, was started as a movement in painting, and you can see that before Impressionism, people tried to depict life realistically in art. And then Impressionists didn't care about so much depicting it identically from what you saw. They wanted to give you their impressions, their thoughts, their feelings about the subject. So it starts to become more abstract. And you can see this painting here, this very beautiful impressionistic painting, which gives us so much feeling about the river. I believe this is the Thames that we're looking at. But I'm not positive. Notice it's not a picture that depicts reality. It's a picture that kind of interprets reality to give us a feeling and an experience. The characteristics of Impressionism can be summed up best in the acronym ELBO, which stands for Everyday Life, Light, Brushstrokes, Outdoor Settings, Weather, and Atmosphere. So those are basically 5 components of Impressionism. Now that's not to say that all Impressionists and all Impressionist paintings are about these things or contain these things, but these are kind of the general characteristics of that movement. Let's go ahead and move on. Impressionism was one of the first painting movements that didn't seek to depict reality. We've already said that. So it's trying to give you the impression, an experience, not based on reality, but based upon the reality of the viewer, the painter. And because of that, Impressionism falls under modernism. And modernism is the idea that truth can be known, but it can't be known easily. I think we've talked about this before in class. That's different than what we have. After World War II, we kind of gave up on the idea that you could know truth. So we have something called postmodernism after World War II. And that's the idea that truth does not exist as an absolute. There are not things that are absolutely right and absolutely wrong to do. There are nothing is totally one way, and many of us believe that, and some of us don't believe that, but the general idea of our time is postmodernism. Okay, so modernism is a little bit different. They believe that there is absolute truth. It's just difficult to know what that truth is. We can make mistakes. It's hard to find out what's true and what's not true in this world. If an accurate depiction of reality is not the concern of Impressionism and modernism, then the truth displayed in the art and literature of the times is subjective rather than objective. So before the modern period, everything tried to be objective. It tried to It tried to depict life as it was, as you saw it, as you experienced it. It's after modernism that we try to depict reality as it is experienced by the viewer, one person. Subjective truth may be colored by the observer's perceptions and ambiguous or not understandable to others. We have to be happy that or comfortable with the idea that things may not fit in a nice, neat little box. There may be some loose ends. We may not get everything that the writer is wanting to tell us, but what we're mostly looking for is an experience of what the writer had. The meaning may be personal rather than universal. It's not, the meaning is not going to be absolute. People aren't going to read the book and say this is what it's about. People may say this is what it's about, but they may have very serious disagreements about it. In our case with Heart of Darkness, one of those disagreements could very well be, is this book itself a racist book? And people come to different opinions on that all the time. And I'll let you come to your own conclusion. I won't tell you what I think. Whether intentionally or not, Joseph Conrad is one of the first writers in English to write impressionistically. Because truth is subjective and filtered through the observer's perceptions, Conrad experiments with the literary element of narrator. Okay, so that makes sense. If Impressionism is what the painter sees, then Impressionism in literature is going to be about narrators and what they choose to give us as details. Conrad doesn't explain everything that the narrators experience. Details are described without comment and designed to create imagery and settings that support tone, the subjective truth of the work, which becomes more important than meaning, perhaps. So once again, we can disagree on the meaning, but we're all going to have the experience, and we'll probably all describe this experience in the same way. Going back to what Joseph Conrad said in that last slide of the intro PowerPoint, he said he wants to leave us with that somber tone. He wants to have he wants us to understand the tone, the theme. He wants us to feel what happened in Africa, and he wants it to resonate with us long after we read the book. That goes along with this impressionism that we see here. Events and utterances by the characters are ambiguous and therefore open to interpretation. Once again, you get to make the meaning. At the end of Heart of Darkness, we are to have had an experience of colonialism and of human nature that is perhaps truer than a novel from a previous time could give. It's one thing to depict, say, an African man who is beaten and abused and left to die in the weeds. It's another thing to describe and to use choice details so that you feel what it's like to be that African man who is beaten and abused and left in the field, in the weeds. So you can see that's the difference between the realistic novel of before and the impressionistic novel now. This is from the preface to Nigger of Narcissus. This is one of Joseph Conrad's books, and it says, Art itself may be defined as a single-minded attempt to render the highest kind of justice to the visible universe by bringing to light the truth, manifold and one, underlying its every aspect. It is an attempt to find in its forms, in its light, in its shadows, in the aspects of matter and in the facts of life, what of each is fundamental, what is enduring and essential, their one illuminating and convincing quality, the very truth of their existence. We have to be comfortable with the idea that that truth may be up to interpretation, but that truth is also something that's not obvious. In order to find the truth, we're going to have to filter through a lot of details and facts. And so we can use fiction in order to find the actual reality of something, because reality itself, with all of its details and facts, kind of can obscure that from us. Joseph Conrad continues, my task, which I am trying to achieve, is by the power of the written word to make you hear, to make you feel. It is before all to make you see that and no more, and it is everything. If I succeed, you shall find there, according to your deserts, encouragement, consolation, fear, charm, all you demand, and perhaps all that glimpse of truth for which you have forgotten to ask. So, once again, the main purpose is to get that experience of what it was like in colonial Africa. This is from another book, section 1 from a Dover Thrift edition, and it says, in each case, notice his reference to the truth. Here, Conrad proclaimed what his contemporaries felt. Only the artist could lead society to the truth. Only the work itself could enable society to understand the truth. The modern artists stood before their audience like prophets addressing the multitudes. The 20th century novelist's work represented a way for the reader to see the new reality. So, once again, this is someone now talking about Joseph Conrad, talking about modernism. We can see that this is the modernist philosophy, that there is truth, but it's hard to find. And so it's Joseph Conrad's job as an artist, as a writer, to help you find the truth. And so, once again, that's what makes this a modern novel. Now let's talk about the structure and the settings just a little bit. Heart of Darkness is actually what's called a novella. It's a short novel. You're supposed to only use novels, plays on the AP test. However, this is such a dense novella that you can use it on the AP test as if it were a novel. Totally okay. This novella is divided up into 3 chapters, essentially 3 parts. Heart of Darkness begins with what's called a frame story. Stories that have a frame story contain a story within a story structure. If you're at all familiar with Frankenstein, which either we have read by now or are going to read, you'll see that Frankenstein begins with the letters of Robert Walton to his sister, not related at all to Victor Frankenstein or the monster that is about to be created. And Robert Walton's talking about to his sister, blah blah blah, and then suddenly Victor Frankenstein comes on the scene, and Robert Walton begins to write down what Victor Frankenstein tells him. And the main story is basically the words of Victor Frankenstein as it is filtered through Robert Walton. Same thing happens here in Heart of Darkness. We have a nameless narrator who is one of the sailors on the boat sitting there on the Thames waiting to leave. He's facing Marlowe, and then Marlowe is that story within a story. Marlowe begins to talk and to tell this story of journeying through Africa, which is essentially Conrad's story, the novelist. So we have quite a few. We have Conrad, and then we have the nameless narrator, and then we have Marlowe. So we have this great separation between us and the actual experience. The first narrator, who is a nameless voice, introduces the present action of a group of sailors sitting on the deck of a large sailboat on the Thames, waiting for the tide to change. He calls it the flood in the book, so that they can raise anchor and head on to Africa. From the nameless narrator, we also get introduced to Marlowe. That's a great tool for finding out what Marlowe looks like and to get some idea of how other people experience Marlowe. I don't know if you've caught it, but Marlowe comes off as almost a Jesus figure or a Buddhist figure, more of a Buddhist figure. As a matter of fact, I think it even says he's Buddhist-like. So he's kind of has this religious feel to him, and that's important because ultimately, if we're talking about greed, materialism, and those type of issues, these are actually spiritual issues. Marlowe has had a spiritual experience, and he wants to tell us about it. And the spiritual experiences are about the heart. In this case, it's about the heart of darkness. Marlowe's the narrator of the inner story, and it's also the more important story. By juxtaposing the frame story setting, that is England, the one that we know, a journey down the Thames River into the growing physical darkness, with the inner story, the one that we don't really know, and that's the journey down the Congo River, and all of its metaphorical darkness, Conrad connects the two settings to make a larger point about humanity and evil. Hey, I don't think Conrad thought that evil and horribleness was just happening in Africa. Maybe just one type of evil and horribleness was happening, but there's a type of evil that exists everywhere. And if we pay attention to what Marlowe says there on the deck early on, he's even going to go back in history to talk about even when England itself was the colony for Rome, when England was Africa to Rome's Belgium. Also, connecting the two stories begins that sinister tone and that feeling of impending doom. This is where we live, and so this is what we are going to experience. This is the preface to Youth again, and he says, Heart of Darkness is obviously written in another mood. I won't characterize the mood precisely, but anybody can see that it is anything but the mood of wistful regret, of reminiscent tenderness. We've read that in the first video. I just wanted to bring it up. Once again, also read in the first video is this idea of what he wants us to get from it, the purpose. So the setting and everything is going to be about darkness because that's what he wants us to experience. He wants us to have that somber tone. He wants to give us a sinister resonance. He wants us to remember this long after we put the book down. So we should be focusing on darkness in this book, not only because it's in the title, but because that's what Joseph Conrad says. That's his purpose and intent. So let's take a look at the first part of the book. This is actually the opening language of part 1. We have the Nelly, a cruising yawl, swung to her anchor without a flutter of the sails and was at rest. The flood had made, that's the tide. The wind was nearly calm, and being bound down the river, the only thing for it was to come to and wait for the turn of the tide. Beautiful two sentences which give us the idea of this ship which has to wait to continue. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're not going to get in action. We are also waiting to go with these people. And in the offset, we are going to hear this wonderful story. It continues. The sea reach of the Thames stretched before us like the beginning of an interminable waterway. In the offing, the sea and the sky were welded together without a joint, and in the luminous space the tanned sails of the barges drifting up with the tide seemed to stand still in red clusters of canvas sharply peaked, with gleams of varnished sprits. A haze rested on the low shores that ran out to sea in vanishing flatness. The air was dark above Gravesend, and farther back still seemed condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding motionlessly over the biggest and the greatest town on earth, which we know is London. Now, we'll go back to Impressionism. We have that acronym, ELBO. Do we see everyday life depicted here? That's the E. And we would say, yes, this is a picture of everyday life. This is what was happening, the sailing. Do we see the L, light, in here? And yes, we see the air was dark. We see the gloom, the mournful gloom. What about brushstrokes? Are those important? Absolutely. Look at the way that Conrad is elaborating his words. He's using, in the first sentence, he's using a positive phrases. He's compounding prepositional phrases. So if we think about these phrases and things as brushstrokes, we can see that his sentences are full of brushstrokes. There are very few that are just simple sentences, simple lines. The O in elbow is outdoor settings. Absolutely, this is outdoor. That tends to be the case with Impressionism because they were so interested in light. Okay, and then finally we have weather and atmosphere, and we do see weather and atmosphere here. Once again, the mournful gloom, the broodingness, the way there was a haze resting on the low shores. So very interesting how we see those elements of Impressionism showing up here in the very opening pages of Heart of Darkness. All right, I'm not going to read everything here, but we can see some highlighted words. Once again, we have with the brooding gloom. Notice we've seen that phrase before. And then we have further on in the paragraph, you can stop and read if you like. We have with the bones, sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion. So we have quite a few bits of language here that remind us of death or of decay, definitely not of vibrant life. And then we end with the day was ending in a serenity of still and exquisite brilliance. The water shone pacifically. The sky, without a speck, was benign immensity of unstained light. The very mist on the Essex marsh was like a gauzy and radiant fabric hung from the wooded rises inland and draping the low shores in diaphanous folds. That's all one sentence. Look at the brushstrokes there, if you will. The elaboration, the clauses, the phrases. Beautiful. Only the gloom to the west, brooding over the upper reaches, became more somber every minute, as if angered by the approach of the sun. Once again, everyday life is depicted there. We see lots of instances of light. I'm going through elbow. We saw the brush strokes. It's still an outdoor setting. And we are still talking about weather and atmosphere. So far, Impressionism seems to be holding true. Let's look at a few more. And at last, in its curved and imperceptible fall, the sun sank low, and from glowing white changed to a dull red without rays and without heat, as if about to go out suddenly, stricken to death by the gloom of that gloom, brooding over a crowd of men. Once again, notice the words gloom and brooding coming together. Very interesting. So I think a question I would ask you about this slide is, how do we see elbow being used here in just this one sentence? This is another one you may want to pause first. And here we're talking about when Marlowe goes to Belgium to apply for this position as captain. And we see we have narrow, deserted streets in deep shadow. We have the windows like eyes, blind eyes with Venetian blinds. So blind eyes would suggest to me dead people, but we have it as a dead silence. Down further on, we have dead in the center. Not this is just describing its position. It's in the center, but notice he uses that word dead. He's emphasizing the death in Europe. And the river was there, fascinating, deadly, like a snake. So he's letting, I mean, if you were to see the river there, you probably wouldn't think death and snake, but he's giving us these details that go beyond realism to give us the experience. We know Africa is going to be about death. It's the heart of darkness. But notice how much death he's showing us here in Europe. One more, and this is also going to be my last one. And so you can stop and read if you'd like. This is a blinding, we've seen that word several times so far. A blinding sunlight drowned all this at times in a sudden recrudescence of glare. And then we have an undersized railway truck lying there on its back with its wheels in the air. I think of like a cockroach here, like a dead cockroach upside down with its wheels or its legs in the air. The thing looked as dead as the carcass of some animal, decaying machinery where dark things seemed to stir feebly. Notice how Conrad is joining things together with metaphorical language to make a bigger picture. If I were to say to you, it was just a railway truck upside down, that's reality. That doesn't do much for me. But when I describe it this way and I picture it as a dead animal, suddenly that gives it some emotional quality, and it's an experience now that I've had of something more than just an upside down railway truck. Sorry, I'm saying upside down. It is upside down. This wheel's in the air. Okay, anyway, that's structure and setting. Let's move on. Let's talk about the narrator now, because the narrator is very important. As Joseph Conrad said, well, we know that Impressionist painting is based upon how the painter is seeing the scene, so we get his truth about it. We're trying to get Joseph Conrad's truth about something. So who is the real narrator here? We have a three-part system. We have Joseph Conrad, who's writing the story. Everything is his words, essentially. It's his ideas, his experiences. Then we have the eye on the Nelly, who's acting as the frame story narrator, the main narrator, as it were. Not maybe the most important one, because that's Marlowe, but he's the one we get to first, who sets everything up for us. And then we have Marlowe, who narrates the story of his journey to Kurtz, to the inner station. And that's where the most of the bulk of the story is concerned with. So notice how Conrad is playing around with perceptions. Whose truth is the real truth? Is it Marlowe's truth? Is it the eye on the boat? Is that his truth about Marlowe and what he heard? Because Marlowe's story is being filtered through the eye. And then, of course, all of this is being filtered through the author, Joseph Conrad. So it's very hard to tell what the real truth is. We need to just trust in what's there and find the experience that will help us understand what this book is about. So once again, the narrator is part of that, the viewing of the Impressionism. Okay, Joseph Conrad writes the story. All diction and imagery is ultimately Conrad's in an attempt to create that sinister tone, that impression of what is occurring in Africa. However, by filtering his story through the observations of two narrators, Conrad separates himself from the content and the story, and he introduces ambiguity. Now notice, I said before that one of the big questions about this book is it a racist book? Well, another question we can ask is Conrad racist? Can what are the things that what Marlowe says to be attributed to Conrad as well? Or is Marlowe his own person? There's a little bit of ambiguity there, because Conrad is writing from the point of view of Marlowe, who is his own person. But obviously Marlowe comes from Conrad's brain. So how much of what Marlowe says and does and experiences is actually Conrad speaking? And that's the ambiguity right there. And it also helps Conrad to separate himself from what is which could be a racist book. So the question is the book racist? And is Conrad racist? And can we ever come to a real answer? These are things that we must ask as literature readers. Finally, let's take a look at this nameless narrator, because it's we can kind of understand how Marlowe is related to Conrad. Look at the eye here. The eye is the nameless narrator, and we see that he tends to focus on more philosophical things, the ideas. He's the one that records Marlowe's thoughts about Britain being like Africa and Rome being like Europe. This whole philosophical idea of people are always treating each other poorly. There is one heart of darkness, and it's not in the world, it's kind of in man. So the eye is kind of the thinking part of this, and then Marlowe himself is more the experience part of this, and Joseph Conrad as the author seems to be the amalgamation of both of those. So this is really a quite interesting thing, and to be honest, this has not happened in literature too much before. Joseph Conrad is actually breaking new literary ground by having this ambiguous narration. And there has been frame stories before, don't get me wrong, but the ambiguity caused by these narrators is something new. Okay, that's going to be the end of part 1 for me. Notice I'm not giving away the story. I'm not talking to you about the content. I'm looking at it more from its literary aspects. From this, I want you to remember elbow, and I want you to be looking for elbow as you read. Okay, so you remember what elbow means, correct? You have E, which is everyday life, L, which is light, B, which is brushstrokes, O is in outdoor settings, and W is weather and atmosphere, kind of like the mood. On brushstrokes, remember that I'm looking at grammar of sentences, the way phrases and clauses are built upon each other. Joseph Conrad is not giving us pointillism, like little teeny pieces of information. Joseph Conrad is using brushstrokes that kind of overlap each other, and they're everywhere, and they're very obvious, if you will. All right, so let's see what you can do with this, and I will catch up to you in the next video, which will be on part 2 of Heart of Darkness.